You serve as the assistant ranking member of the House Public Safety Committee. Now, there's a measure that's moving through this committee which would reduce sentences for felony property crimes. Now, you have some concerns on this bill, but first let's talk about Senate Bill 5755 and what it would do.
I have some real concerns about this bill based on the testimony that we heard during committee this past week. Essentially what this bill does is it forces down the sentencing guidelines for offenders who have committed or have been convicted of property crimes. Crimes like burglary, whether that be residential or commercial, theft, malicious mischief issues, issues of that sort. It pushes down the sentencing guidelines to the point where first, second, and even third-time offenders have no jail time whatsoever. Even higher offenders that would typically be going to prison under the current sentencing guideline, would be spending their time in county jails instead of going to prison. That's one of my chief concerns, and we'll address that a little bit further in here. But this bill also provides some funding for grants to local police agencies to address the property crime rates, which, by the way, property crime rates in Washington are the highest in the nation. So it's something that we really do need to address. However, I have concerns about how those grants would actually be applied out there in our communities. And lastly, it depends on community supervision for these offenders at the local level. The offenders who are now getting very reduced sentences or no jail sentences at all, it hires about 106 to 110 new community corrections officers for DOC to provide about 1 year of community supervision. And while these folks are going through the community supervision, it depends on drug treatment and programming to affect that cycle of recidivism. So, this bill has a very good motivation, and I applaud the motivation behind the bill, but I believe that the specific provisions within the bill will actually lead to increased crime, and I'll try to explain those.
What are your concerns about this bill?
We have to be able to hit every single point in here and be successful for this bill to stand up. It's kind of like a three-legged stool, really. If you remove one of these elements of the bill, it will end up being unsuccessful. So if we don't put enough funding in this bill, we're not going to have the grants available for local law enforcement, we're not going to have the treatment and programming available for the offenders, and we're not going to have the supervision available for these offenders. So if you remove the funding element of it, it will not be successful. If you remove the treatment and programming from it, we won't be successful with the recidivism rates. If we remove the supervision away from it, it'll result in the same thing. What we're trying to do here is address the rate of recidivism and drive down the property crime rate in Washington State. But when it comes down to addressing that property crime rate in our state, we have to have a good, effective programming within our law enforcement. And that's where the grant section of this comes in. I really believe that the grant section of this bill is really pretty weak. I don't believe that it provides sufficient funding to really address the crime rate on a statewide level. And the way the bill is written, that will result in rule writing and a formula to obtain these grants. It will essentially direct these grant dollars to larger, more metropolitan areas of the state. And so actually, in the end, the people in the more rural areas and more rural and smaller counties and agencies throughout the state will actually see an increase in crime because we won't have the law enforcement programs in place to deal with their local issues.
How did this bill come about?
This bill came about as a result of a governor's study on this issue. And here again, as I mentioned before, I really applaud the motivation behind bringing this issue forward. I think that obviously what was found in this study that the governor's work group did was that sentences in jail don't necessarily address recidivism and keep people out of jail in the future. And just addressing it on the corrections level didn't change it. So they're trying to take a different look at how we really affect property crime rate in Washington State. And what I fear is that this bill just does not meet the mark. And in the end, I'm just really afraid, and many other law enforcement folks are afraid that it's actually going to increase crime, especially in the smaller, more rural areas of the state. One of my local sheriff, my boss, Sheriff Ty Trineri, came down and testified against this bill when we heard it in committee. And the House bill that went through prior, I actually heard from all three of my sheriffs, Island County, Skagit County, and Snohomish County, with some real serious concerns about this bill. So I will be addressing this bill through some very specific amendments, whether that be in committee or on the floor later on.
What is the status of the bill?
It was heard in committee on the 24th of this month, and it's due to be exec next week on April 1st. So, and that's when you'll see the first group of amendments to this bill come through, trying to work on the weak points, try to bring it further back up to snuff, and ensure that the funding is in place, which is such a critical factor. Once the bill is voted out of Public Safety Committee, it'll go to Appropriations for them to consider it for budget purposes, and then it'll potentially go to the floor.
If people want to offer thoughts about this bill, what can they do?
You know, I would be very interested in hearing the thoughts of folks out in the community. You can email me anytime you want. My contact information is on the bottom of the screen, or you can always find me at www.leg.wa.gov.